January 14, 1944. 25,000 feet above Germany, the sky was alive with chaos. Silver contrails tangled across a pale winter sun. The deep rumble of engines echoed through thin air, the sound of 100 American bombers crawling toward the heart of the Reich. Beneath them, a single P-51 Mustang broke formation. Its polished aluminum skin glinted as it rolled on its side and dove, a maneuver no instructor would ever approve. Tracers streaked past. The pilot's gloved hand pushed the throttle forward, the Merlin engine howling as if alive. In that instant, the Mustang became something else. No longer a guardian escorting bombers, but a predator in open skies. A dangerous, instinctive move that would change the course of aerial combat. Because that pilot's decision turned the P-51 Mustang into the most feared hunter of World War II. In 1942, the skies over Europe were a graveyard of aluminum. The U.S. Army Air Forces had begun their daylight bombing campaign, a bold strategy meant to cripple the German war machine by striking its factories, rail lines, and oil refineries deep inside the Reich. But there was a problem. Their bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, could fly high, fly far, and take heavy damage. But they couldn't defend themselves forever. Once they crossed into German airspace, the Luftwaffe descended on them like hawks. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s tore through bomber formations with ruthless precision. The Americans called it the combat box. Dozens of bombers flying in tight, geometric patterns, each gunner covering another. It looked good on paper, a fortress in the sky. But no formation could hold against swarms of veteran German pilots trained since Spain and Poland. By late 1943, losses were unsustainable. Entire squadrons vanished over Bremen, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg. On one October mission alone, the second raid on Schweinfurt, 60 of 291 bombers never came home. Over 600 airmen were missing or dead. The message was clear. Daylight bombing without proper escort was suicide. At the same time, the British Royal Air Force flew by night, relying on darkness for protection. The Americans, however, insisted that precision bombing in daylight would deliver faster results. That conviction demanded something they didn't yet have: a fighter that could fly alongside bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Their existing fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning, were powerful but limited. The P-47 was a brute, armed and armored like a tank, but its fuel range barely covered western France. The twin-engine P-38 went farther, but suffered in cold, high-altitude conditions. The Luftwaffe had the advantage. Its fighters could climb faster, dive harder, and return to base before American escorts even reached the German frontier. So, Allied planners went searching for something new. That answer began quietly in 1940, before America had even entered the war. In Britain, the Air Ministry approached a small American company, North American Aviation, with a simple request: build a fighter for the Royal Air Force. The British wanted it fast, and North American promised something better than the underperforming P-40s they were using. In just 117 days, engineers led by Edgar Schmood produced a prototype unlike anything before it. Sleek, low drag, and efficient. It was named the Mustang, but there was a catch. The early Mustangs, powered by the American Allison engine, performed well at low altitudes but suffocated above 15,000 feet, exactly where bomber formations flew. At first, the U.S. Army wasn't interested. The Mustang was seen as a British project, a secondary design compared to their own fighters. But war has a way of changing minds. When British test pilots began experimenting with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same one that powered the legendary Spitfire, everything changed. The P-51 with a Merlin under its hood could reach 30,000 feet with ease. It could outrun, outclimb, and outfight nearly anything in the sky. The Mustang had the range, the power, the agility. All that was left was the tactic, the mindset, to use it as more than an escort. And that's where one pilot's dangerous idea would soon come in. By late 1943, the Allied bombing campaign was at a breaking point. Factories in Germany still ran day and night, and each attempt to strike them meant sending thousands of young airmen into a sky ruled by the Luftwaffe. Then, almost silently, the Mustang entered the war. At first, it appeared in small numbers, sleek, unfamiliar among the bulky Thunderbolts and twin-engined Lightnings. The P-51B and P-51C, equipped with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, were faster, lighter, and could fly nearly twice the range of any other American fighter. For the first time, a single-seat fighter could escort bombers all the way from England to the industrial heart of Germany, and back again. It was a revolution that many didn't fully understand yet. On December 11, 1943, the 354th Fighter Group, nicknamed the Pioneer Mustang Group, flew its first escort mission. The results were immediate and stunning. The Luftwaffe, used to attacking unprotected bombers, suddenly faced fighters in regions they'd considered safe. German pilots were forced to climb higher, attack faster, and retreat earlier. Still, there were doubts. Commanders instructed Mustang pilots to stay close to the bomber formations, to guard them at all costs. The pilots were effectively flying shields, tied to slow, vulnerable aircraft, while their instincts screamed for freedom to engage. It was a frustrating rule, but understandable. The priority was the bombers. Every aircraft carried 10 men and thousands of pounds of explosives vital to the Allied cause. Losing even a few was catastrophic. But as January 1944 arrived, cracks began to show. Pilots reported that by staying locked to formation, they were always one step behind. The Luftwaffe would attack, strike fast, then vanish before the Mustangs could react. The numbers didn't lie. Even with the P-51's arrival, bombers were still being shot down in staggering numbers. The Mustang's potential was being wasted, caged by doctrine. Meanwhile, inside the Luftwaffe, exhaustion was growing. The once invincible fighter arm was bleeding pilots faster than it could replace them. By 1944, many German airmen had survived hundreds of missions, but the newcomers had little training and almost no combat experience. The Allies were flooding the skies with thousands of aircraft. Germany simply couldn't keep up. Fuel shortages began to bite. Replacement engines arrived late or not at all. The massive industrial cities that once supplied the Luftwaffe, Essen, Leipzig, Regensburg, were now under daily threat. Still, the German pilots fought on. Men like Erich Hartmann and Gerhard Barkhorn continued to score kills at a terrifying pace. But even they knew the tide was turning. In England, the U.S. 8th Air Force was reorganizing. Under the command of General Jimmy Doolittle, a man known for daring and logic in equal measure, the doctrine began to shift. He understood something crucial. The war in the air wasn't just about defense. It was about control. To win, the Allies couldn't just protect their bombers. They had to destroy the Luftwaffe in the air. The P-51 Mustang was about to be unleashed. Pilots were quietly encouraged to range ahead of bomber formations, to hunt German fighters before they ever reached the bombers, to seek, strike, and kill. This subtle shift, from defensive escort to offensive hunter, would change the air war completely. And at the heart of that transformation stood one pilot's instinct, one maneuver that dared to defy the manual. A move that would teach every Mustang pilot what their aircraft was truly built for. 1. The human angle. The men behind the Mustang. Every revolution in warfare begins not with machines, but with the men who dare to trust them. In 1944, most Mustang pilots were barely in their 20s. Many had never seen Europe before they were asked to defend it. They came from Texas, California, Illinois, farm boys, mechanics, dreamers, thrust into a frozen sky where survival depended on reflexes and instinct. They lived in cramped Nissen huts across East Anglia, their days marked by briefings at dawn and nervous laughter over tin mugs of coffee. Each mission meant hours of biting cold at 25,000 feet, the oxygen mask freezing to their faces, hands trembling not from fear alone, but from the deep chill of the high atmosphere. They flew, knowing that once they crossed the Rhine, there was no turning back. No rescue if shot down. No soft landing in enemy territory. Every decision in the air was made in seconds. A wrong move could cost not just their life, but the entire formation they guarded. Yet, despite the odds, their confidence grew with every flight. They felt something different in the Mustang, a sense that the machine was alive, responsive, almost sentient under their touch. The Mustang didn't just carry them, it obeyed them. It encouraged them to be bold, and in that bond between man and machine, courage found its sharpest edge. The technological angle. The machine that changed the sky, the P-51 Mustang, wasn't just another aircraft. It was an engineering anomaly, a perfect convergence of design, aerodynamics, and power. At its heart roared the Rolls-Royce Merlin 1650 engine, capable of pushing the aircraft past 440 miles per hour at altitudes where most engines gasped for air. Its laminar flow wing, a revolutionary innovation, reduced drag so effectively that the Mustang could fly farther, faster, and more efficiently than any Allied fighter before it. With drop tanks slung under its wings, the Mustang could escort bombers to Berlin, nearly 800 miles, and still have enough fuel to dogfight on the way home. Its bubble canopy gave pilots a 360-degree view, turning situational awareness into a weapon. But technology alone didn't make it deadly. How it was used did. The Mustang's speed and maneuverability allowed pilots to roll inverted, dive vertically, and climb in ways the Luftwaffe hadn't anticipated. Its handling at high speeds meant it could chase a fleeing FW-190 and still maintain control. To the Germans, it was shocking. An American fighter that could finally challenge their best. To the Allies, it was liberation, an aircraft that erased the one advantage Germany had held since 1939, control of the air. And yet, in those first months of combat, few realized that the Mustang's most powerful feature wasn't its engine or guns, it was its adaptability, a quality that one daring pilot was about to exploit in a way no manual could teach. The tactical angle, from escorts to hunters by early 1944, the Mustang's true test began. The U.S. 8th Air Force had hundreds of bombers flying daily raids into Germany, and the P-51s were assigned to protect them. Commanders initially demanded tight escort formations, fighters circling close, never venturing far. But pilots quickly noticed a problem. The Luftwaffe dictated every fight. German formations would strike from high altitude, break away, and reassemble for another pass, while the Mustangs, restricted by orders, could only chase briefly before returning to the bombers. It was a game of reaction, and the Allies were always a step behind. Then came a quiet shift in strategy. General Jimmy Doolittle, taking command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, issued new orders. Your mission is not just to protect the bombers, it's to destroy the enemy air force. This changed everything. Mustang pilots were now free to roam, to sweep ahead of bomber formations, intercepting German fighters before they reached their targets. This freedom turned disciplined escorts into hunters. Dogfights that once took place near the bombers now erupted miles ahead of them. The Mustang's range allowed pilots to chase enemies deep into their own airfields, cutting them down as they took off or landed. What began as a defensive mission became an aggressive, calculated purge of the Luftwaffe's strength. And soon, amid this chaos, one pilot would discover a new way to fight. A maneuver so dangerous that it defied all training, yet proved devastatingly effective. 44 honeymeter churimar naman toor form. The leadership angle. Jimmy Doolittle's gamble. In January 1944, leadership took a decisive turn. Lieutenant General James Jimmy Doolittle, a legend of the 1942 Tokyo raid, assumed command of the U.S. 8th Air Force. He arrived with a clear, uncompromising vision. The air war would no longer be about endurance, but annihilation. Doolittle understood that the only way to win control of the skies was to destroy the Luftwaffe, not merely defend against it. His orders tore through established doctrine like a thunderclap. Pilots were no longer shackled to their bombers. Instead, they were to seek out and eliminate enemy fighters wherever they could be found. To traditionalists, it sounded reckless, but Doolittle knew the psychology of airmen. Give them initiative, and they would innovate. The Mustang, with its range and speed, was the perfect tool for this new freedom. Doolittle's gamble paid off almost instantly. By loosening control, he unleashed creativity. Squadrons began experimenting with high-speed dives, slashing attacks, and new formation tactics. Pilots learned that the Mustang's best defense was aggression. He turned escort duty into air domination, and in doing so, he gave birth to the hunter's instinct that would make the P-51 a nightmare for the Luftwaffe. The enemy angle. The Luftwaffe's desperate struggle by early 1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting a war it could no longer sustain. The once formidable fighter arm, Jagdwaffe, was bleeding to death in its own skies. Every day, Allied bombers poured deeper into German territory, escorted by Mustangs that never seemed to run out of fuel or courage. German pilots had once dictated every engagement. Now they were hunted. Fuel shortages crippled training programs. New pilots were rushed into combat with only a handful of flight hours. Veterans like Adolf Galland and Erich Hartmann warned that Germany was losing its edge. Not because of aircraft quality, but because of exhaustion. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and FW 190 were still deadly machines. In experienced hands, they could climb faster and turn tighter than most Allied planes. But combat wasn't about brief duels anymore. It was about endurance, and the Luftwaffe had none left. Mustang pilots could follow them anywhere, across the Ruhr, over Leipzig, even deep into Bavaria. Airfields that once felt safe became killing grounds. German mechanics buried aircraft in snow and dirt to hide them from strafing runs. Every time a Luftwaffe pilot took off, he knew he might never land again. By mid-1944, losses reached catastrophic levels. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had become prey in its own airspace. The German High Command watched helplessly as the tide turned. The enemy was not just stronger, it was smarter, faster, and unrelenting. The moral and psychological angle, the power of air superiority. There is a silent cost in victory. By mid-1944, the Allies controlled the skies, utterly and without challenge. The Mustang's arrival had turned the air war into a one-sided hunt. To the bomber crews, that dominance felt like salvation. The black plumes of burning B-17s grew fewer each month. Survival rates soared. Hope returned. But for the pilots of the 8th Air Force, it came with a burden. They saw the faces of men they once feared now fighting hopeless battles, spiraling from the clouds in flames. They strafed airfields, convoys, and trains, often without opposition. It was necessary for victory, but it was also relentless. Psychologists would later describe it as combat fatigue, the emotional toll of superiority. To kill, day after day, and still feel the ghost of fear. Yet, it was that dominance, that complete psychological control, which broke the Luftwaffe's spirit long before the final collapse. For the Germans on the ground, the constant scream of Merlin engines overhead was a daily reminder that the Reich's defenses were crumbling. For the Allies, it was the sound of inevitability. And for one pilot, flying at the edge of control, it was the sound of possibility. The moment to push further, to try something no manual had written. The skies were his canvas, and the maneuver that followed would etch his name and the Mustang's legend into history. February 20th, 1944. The air over Leipzig was chaos. The U.S. 8th Air Force had launched what would later be known as Big Week, a massive, coordinated offensive designed to cripple the German aircraft industry. Hundreds of B-17s thundered across the Reich, escorted by a new, fast, silver Phantom, the P-51 Mustang. Among those pilots was Major George Preddy, a name that would soon become legend. He was leading a flight of Mustangs from the 352nd Fighter Group, the blue-nosed bastards of Bodny. Their mission? Escort bombers to the target, engage only if attacked. The sky above the bombers was a storm of metal. German Bf-109s sliced through the formation in vertical dives, rolling away before the Americans could react. Preddy's radio crackled. Frantic calls, scattered directions, the sound of heavy breathing and gunfire. And then he saw it. A pair of FW-190s diving on a crippled B-17, their cannons flashing. The bomber's left wing caught fire instantly. 10 men inside, trapped. Preddy didn't hesitate. But instead of the usual turn-and-climb approach, the maneuver every pilot was trained to make, he did something radical. He rolled inverted, pushed the nose down, and dove straight toward the Germans, not from above, but from below. It was suicide on paper. Every manual warned against such an approach. Diving beneath the enemy meant sacrificing altitude, energy, and the ability to climb out. But Preddy knew his Mustang could handle it. Its laminar flow wings and Merlin engine gave it the speed to recover, the power to climb faster than the enemy could react. He felt the G-forces crush him as the altimeter spun. The horizon flipped. The earth filled his windscreen. He leveled out just above the treetops, fire streaking past his canopy. Then, using the Mustang's superior roll rate, he pulled hard into a vertical climb, a maneuver so tight that his own formation momentarily lost him. The Germans, expecting a standard breakaway, overshot. Preddy came up behind them, his guns already aligned. In seconds, the first FW-190 burst into flame. The second tried to roll away, but the Mustang stayed glued to its tail, climbing, twisting, hunting. This was the moment the Mustang changed. It was no longer the shepherd of bombers. It was the hawk. Preddy's attack defied regulation, but it proved something every pilot had felt deep down. The Mustang could dominate not through caution, but through controlled aggression. When he landed back in England, his crew counted more bullet holes than they could patch. But the mission report stunned the high command. 3 enemy fighters destroyed, none lost. Word spread quickly across the 8th Air Force. Pilots began experimenting with similar tactics. Low dives, split S reversals, high G climbs. These were maneuvers that leveraged every ounce of the Mustang's aerodynamic advantage. In hangars and briefing rooms, they began calling it the Preddy turn, a nickname whispered more than recorded, but one that captured the spirit of a fighter that refused to fly by the book. From that day, escort duty would never be the same. Mustang pilots began to fly offensively, no longer reacting to the Luftwaffe, but anticipating it. They took the fight to the enemy's doorstep, patrolling deep over German airfields and attacking anything that moved. Each success reinforced the lesson. Risk, when calculated and understood, could redefine victory. The dangerous maneuver that began as instinct became doctrine. A transformation born not in laboratories or strategy rooms, but in the frozen skies of Germany, under the pressure of combat. And it wasn't just one man anymore. It was every Mustang pilot who followed, each one pushing the limits a little further. Because once the Predator had tasted freedom, there was no going back. By March 1944, the skies above Europe had changed color, no longer dominated by the dark silhouettes of German fighters, but streaked with the silver wings of Mustangs. The transformation began quietly. Reports filtered through the 8th Air Force headquarters at High Wycombe, kill ratios improving, bomber losses dropping. Mustang squadrons, once told to stay with the heavies, were now taking independent hunts deep into enemy airspace. The Luftwaffe began to feel the difference almost immediately. In the words of German ace Adolf Galland, "When the Mustangs appeared over Berlin, we knew the war was lost." The maneuver, the dangerous low dive and vertical roll that Preddy had made famous, became a blueprint. In combat debriefings it was analyzed, refined, and taught. Pilots realized that the P-51's laminar wing design allowed it to maintain control at high speeds, where other aircraft simply tore apart. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, built under license by Packard in America, gave it both high-altitude performance and low-altitude acceleration. The Preddy turn wasn't just a trick, it was physics turned into art. Young pilots arriving in England learned it within weeks. Instructors demonstrated it at 10,000 feet, rolling inverted and diving until the horizon blurred, then pulling up in a sharp, spiraling climb that could outmatch even the Messerschmitt's response time. The move was brutal on the body. Pilots described temporary blackouts as G-forces spiked. But when executed right, it placed them perfectly on the enemy's tail. The Luftwaffe, desperate to counter this new aggression, ordered its own pilots to avoid vertical engagements. But the damage was done. For the first time, German aces found themselves hunted. On April 11, 1944, during a bomber raid on Poznan, a formation of P-51s led by Lieutenant Donald Gentile used the maneuver to ambush a group of Bf-109s that had just taken off. In less than 5 minutes, the Mustangs destroyed 8 aircraft, all before the Germans could even reach altitude. It wasn't luck. It was the evolution of air tactics happening in real time. The P-51 squadrons now flew with the mentality of predators. They scanned not only for enemy fighters, but for opportunity. Altitude, angle, light. Pilots spoke of feeling the air, anticipating the opponent's next move. In just 3 months, the Mustang units claimed over 1,500 enemy aircraft. The Luftwaffe's veteran corps, men who had fought since the Battle of Britain, was being wiped out. The skies that once belonged to Germany were now hunting grounds for America's new killers. In German cities below, the population began to notice something strange. The contrails no longer meant safety for bombers escorted by slow P-47s or P-38s. They meant the coming of the Mustang. Silent until its dive, fatal when it appeared. Photographs from reconnaissance cameras captured the change. Luftwaffe airfields burning, hangars reduced to ash, half-repaired aircraft left abandoned. The Mustang was no longer merely escorting war, it was delivering it. The shift was psychological, too. Bomber crews, once terrified of the return flight, began to trust the silver shapes above them. Morale soared. Pilots and gunners described the Mustangs as angels. Silver angels with guns, one B-17 radio operator called them. But among the fighter pilots themselves, something deeper stirred. Pride mixed with danger. The maneuver that made them invincible also demanded perfection. A slight miscalculation, a delayed roll, or a mistimed pull could send even the best pilot into the ground. Several men died practicing it. Yet none questioned its necessity. Because in that deadly ballet of dive, roll, and climb, they had found the secret that made the Mustang a legend: total control at the edge of chaos. By the time Allied bombers struck Berlin in daylight raids by mid-1944, the outcome was clear. The Luftwaffe could no longer challenge the skies. The Predator had claimed its domain. The P-51 Mustang, and the fearless men who dared to break the rules, had turned the tide of the air war. And as the smoke cleared over Germany's burning cities, one question remained: what would the cost of that dominance be once the war ended? Because even victory carries its shadows. By the summer of 1944, the skies over Europe belonged to the Allies. The transformation was complete. From the desperate defensive battles of 1943 to total aerial supremacy just 1 year later. For the German Luftwaffe, it was a catastrophe measured not just in aircraft lost, but in the loss of experience itself. Pilots who had fought since the early days of the war, men like Walter Nowotny and Heinz Baer, were gone, killed, captured, or grounded by exhaustion. Each loss meant not only a missing aircraft, but the disappearance of irreplaceable skill. Training schools were overwhelmed. Young recruits, barely 20 years old, were rushed into combat with only a handful of flight hours. Many never survived their first mission. They took off and vanished. The Allied reports told a clear story. From January to July 1944, Luftwaffe fighter strength fell by nearly 60%. Mustang units claimed thousands of kills. The numbers were staggering. In one 30-day stretch, P-51 squadrons destroyed more than 1,000 German aircraft. But even more critical was what couldn't be measured: fear. German ground crews began painting camouflage over their airfields, hiding hangars beneath trees. Fuel shortages crippled operations. Entire squadrons sat grounded, their engines cold, waiting for supplies that never arrived. Meanwhile, in the high command rooms of Berlin, air defense maps turned from blue to red. For every city that was bombed, Hamburg, Munich, Cologne, the Luftwaffe's ability to strike back weakened further. The Mustang had become not only an escort, but a weapon of suppression. American bomber losses dropped dramatically. In early 1943, the odds of a B-17 crew surviving 25 missions had been less than 25%. By late 1944, with Mustangs overhead, those odds had nearly doubled. And yet, the victory in the sky came at a price. P-51 pilots faced intense psychological pressure. They were trained to escort, but ordered to pursue. They hunted not just enemy aircraft, but human beings. Men parachuting from burning cockpits, trucks fleeing airfields, even locomotives carrying fuel to the front. For many, the line between combat and survival blurred. In letters home, pilots described the strange beauty of battle: the sun reflecting off the wings, the thunder of the Merlin engine, the silence after the kill. Some wrote that they no longer felt excitement, only a numb professionalism. The war had turned them into machines of precision, and that precision made victory possible. In the Allied press, headlines celebrated the Mustang miracle. Magazines printed photographs of pilots smiling beside their sleek aircraft. Kill markings lined beneath the canopy. The public saw heroes, but inside those cockpits were young men barely in their 20s, exhausted, haunted, and aware that one small mistake could turn triumph into tragedy. At the same time, the Mustang's reputation spread beyond Europe. In the Pacific, squadrons prepared to deploy it against Japan. Engineers in America studied the design, learning how to merge speed, range, and agility into a single frame. The P-51 wasn't just a weapon anymore. It had become a blueprint for the future of air power. And yet, as the Allies closed in on Germany from all directions, one truth stood above all: the skies were no longer shared. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force on Earth, had been hunted into extinction. But history was not done with the Mustang yet, because what followed the fall of the Luftwaffe was something even greater, the beginning of a new age of flight, shaped by the lessons written in the clouds of 1944. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the skies over Europe told their own story. Airfields once packed with Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs now lay abandoned. Rows of scorched concrete, twisted metal, and the smell of burned fuel lingering like ghosts. The P-51 Mustang stood parked in neat, polished lines at Allied bases across England, France, and Germany. Many bore the scars of war. Bullet holes patched with metal, black streaks from exhaust and gunfire. Yet each one carried the same symbol: victory through air power. Historians would later call it the plane that won the air war. But inside briefing rooms, the discussions had already moved forward. Engineers and strategists knew that the P-51 was not just the end of an era. It was the beginning of a new one. Its combination of range, agility, and speed became the new standard for fighter design. The lessons of its success, laminar flow wings, high-efficiency cooling systems, long-range fuel tanks, were studied in laboratories from California to Moscow. Within just 2 years, those ideas would give birth to the first true jet fighters of the post-war world. The Mustang had shown that air supremacy wasn't about raw power alone. It was about endurance, precision, and adaptability. For many of its pilots, however, peace was harder to adjust to. They had lived at full throttle, bodies molded to the rhythm of aerial combat. Now, grounded, they found silence more terrifying than battle. Some returned home and became commercial pilots, flying passengers instead of patrols. Others joined the newly formed U.S. Air Force, carrying the Mustang's spirit into the Cold War. But many struggled to leave the war behind. Greg "Pappy" Boyington, one of America's most famous aces, once said, "When you've lived that close to death, everything else feels too slow." For the German pilots who survived, reflection came with bitterness. Men like Adolf Galland and Johannes Steinhoff later admitted that by 1944, the Luftwaffe had been fighting a losing battle. "We were outnumbered, outfueled, and outflown," Steinhoff wrote in his memoir. The Mustang broke our back. The legacy of that truth would echo for decades. During the Berlin airlift, former wartime enemies watched the same kind of American aircraft, now unarmed, deliver food to a starving city. The same skies that had once burned now carried supplies, not bombs. And many of the aircraft's designers, engineers, and test pilots had come from lessons learned in the P-51 program. The plane's image became timeless: polished metal, red spinner, twin 50-caliber barrels glinting in sunlight. Museums across the world displayed it as a symbol of freedom and technological triumph. But beneath that shine lies the human story. The thousands who never returned. The evolution paid for in blood and courage, because every innovation the Mustang inspired, from the jet age to modern stealth fighters, was born from that dangerous moment in 1944, when one pilot dared to break the rules. In that roll, that dive, that leap into chaos, the future of aerial warfare was written. The P-51 had transcended its role. It was no longer just a machine of war. It had become a symbol of courage under impossible odds, of perfection forged through danger, and of how a single act of instinct can change history. The skies were peaceful again, but the echo of the Mustang's engine still lingered. A whisper of power, freedom, and the will to push beyond fear itself. And from that echo, a new generation of aviators would rise, guided by the lesson that air superiority begins not with the machine, but with the mind behind it. The story of the P-51 Mustang isn't just about a machine. It's about a mindset, the courage to question limits, and the willingness to face death in pursuit of mastery. When that pilot rolled his aircraft into a forbidden dive in 1944, he wasn't thinking of rewriting history. He was thinking of survival. Yet, that moment, born of instinct and defiance, revealed something far deeper: the hidden potential of man and machine in perfect harmony. From that point on, the P-51 was no longer an escort. It was evolution in flight, a symbol of precision and freedom in an age defined by destruction. In every roar of its Merlin engine lay the sound of an idea that outlived the war, that innovation often begins where safety ends. Decades later, the P-51 still flies at air shows, its silver wings gleaming in sunlight, its song echoing across peaceful skies. Children look up in awe, unaware that the plane before them once decided the fate of nations. But those who remember, historians, pilots, and dreamers, understand. They know that in that single dangerous maneuver lay the essence of human progress itself: boldness, sacrifice, and the unyielding belief that we can always go higher. And so, the legend of the Mustang endures, not as a weapon of war, but as the timeless proof that courage can change the sky,